Hey there troops, it's me TheTacticalBrit, and today I want to go over everything that I use in Battlefield 5 in terms of settings, and I personally believe that these are the best settings you can possibly use on console as it presently stands. A lot of you guys have seen the stuff I get up to on streams, you've seen some of the gameplay that I can produce, and most of that comes down to the fact that I feel I have a perfect setup in order to do that, and some of that is hardware related, and I'll touch on that, but most of that is definitely options orientated, and I'm going to go over all of that today in this handy little guide. So we're going to start off with the basics in controls, and soldier aim sensitivity is something that I push quite high, I guess. 54% is what I go for, and I'll show you why exactly in a little while because there is something else that slightly balances it out. 54% in my opinion is exactly where that should be, and it feels very natural and it feels like a good place it should stay at. Moving on, I haven't really changed any of these settings, except for vehicle aim sensitivity. I kind of keep that in and around the 40s, mostly purely down to the fact that, the 40s for me seem to be a quite fast and rapid speed. Although the turret speed, of course, doesn't match it, it does make a lot of sense to have it set that way. So, moving on from this, we're going to go over to the control scheme. I use the veteran vehicle driver sticks. I don't like the default ones. The veteran ones are where I stay at. And the reason for that is just purely because I feel the analog sticks don't necessarily give you a good indication of acceleration and reverse sometimes. Especially when you're in a tank, the last thing you want to be doing is messing around with that. So I tend to stick those more or less on the veteran side. But of course, controller preference might be something that you personally find a bit different. And of course you can do custom controller preferences, and for soldier buttons, the one thing I do highly recommend, although I have it on default here, but I actually have it in my universal accessibility settings down here, is actually getting rid of L2 and R2 to aim and fire and replacing it with L1 and R1. And for those of you who watched my recent M1A1 carbine video, you'll probably understand exactly why that is. The springs in the L2 and R2 have some kind of retention, they have a delay, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the buttons that you're pressing will be an instantaneous reaction, whereas the bumpers on L1 and R1 are instant, and that allows you to have A faster trigger finger, and B, definitely minimizes your reaction time. So by any given means, I highly recommend using the bumpers as opposed to triggers. Regardless of what platform you're on, triggers will always use some form of spring mechanism, and that isn't ideal for what you want, especially if you're looking for something like a trigger figure, like just general reaction time, and I highly recommend swapping those out. Moving on now to the advanced settings, stick aiming acceleration. This is something that's in the game. It's currently set to 100. Drop it right down to 20. This is really important. It's something that kind of balances out having a higher sensitivity. In Battlefield 1, you may notice that the acceleration in Battlefield 1 is a bit more fluid. You may notice that when you turn, you're a little bit slower, you're a little bit more sluggish, whereas in Battlefield 4, it's very snappy and very fast. When you turn left and right, it's almost as though you're like darting around as opposed to slowly moving around. And that's exactly what stick aiming acceleration does. And I have a higher sensitivity at 54, but I counterbalance it by putting this to 20, and it creates a really natural and fluid feeling in terms of moving around and aiming, and I definitely recommend having it around 20%. Moving on to this, we have uniform soldier aiming. Highly recommend putting this on. It basically just helps you with muscle memory, and it will teach you to effectively get better at the game down the line. I don't really want to explain the ins and outs, but if you use this somewhere down the line, the more you play the game, the more you'll have muscle memory, the more things will be easier. Moving on from this, I don't necessarily have any of these changed vehicle aim relative controls. I keep the same. I don't decouple the aiming either from turning because I don't think that's necessary. And I don't change any of the zoom values because I feel as though you want consistency across the plane. Regardless of how far away the zoom is, I still think in Battlefield you need a consistent level of control. And of course, the more variables you introduce by changing sensitivity up here, the more variables you have to account for when it's something you don't really want to be thinking about. I don't necessarily want to think, oh yeah, I'm using a 4x scope, so my sensitivity is going to be X, Y, or Z. That's not what you want in the game. You want a consistent thing across the entire board, and that's exactly what I'd recommend. Moving on to controller tuning, I haven't actually changed any of this at all. They also have the input threshold, which is what I was talking about for the trigger fingers, which is why you shouldn't have them on L2 and R2 at all. You can put those down to 0, but it will feel very strange. It will feel very unnatural in comparison to the bumpers. And the dead zones I keep more or less the same. I don't mess around with any of this stuff. The dead zones, I think if you start moving around with them too much, you start making some errors. So I leave those as they are. I also want to recommend here that I actually am just using a base PS4 controller. I don't have any kind of specialist controller as it presently stands, nor do I have any kind of sponsorship or anything like that. However, that's probably something I should work on as a YouTube channel eventually. And that's basically it for the controller settings. Moving on to gameplay. There is a lot of stuff here that I do. We of course have all the HUD on. We do not have the chat log, we do not have magnify chat, and we don't really have this on. Sometimes when active, other times I turn it off completely. I kind of turn it off completely when I definitely know what I have in my class. I leave it when active when I'm messing around with things. Mostly because the less screen space you can take up with clutter, the better. Crosshair color I do at bright pink. Nothing in Battlefield 5 is bright pink, and because of that it makes for a perfect crosshair color regardless of what the setting is, whether it's grey, whether it's bright, whether it's anything, you will always see bright pink. Kill log I turn off. There is no need for the kill log in Battlefield 5, it just takes up unnecessary screen space. You know when you kill somebody because you get the skull on your screen. You don't need to know when other people have been killed through the kill log. It's not as important. You're never really going to know the username of your enemy anyway, so there's no tactical advantage to keeping it on, except for kind of abusing your screen space, and you don't really want that. I turn off stuff like critical messages. I turn off other things like, you know, hint systems and stuff like that, which I'll show you later. This is something you're going to want to increase a little bit. It's the shadow that's behind white text. It makes text easier to see. I up that to around about 50%. Now, moving on, we have hit color, headshot color, and kill color. I have the headshot color at bright green because, again, it's nice and noticeable. Nothing else really is bright green in the game, but you can mess around with some other colors, bright blue, bright orange, anything like that. Anything that's just distinct. Bright green is a very jarring color. There isn't many bright greens in the game. They're more sort of darker greens, and because of that, whenever I get a headshot, I'm very aware that I have got a headshot. And of course, the kill color I keep the same. Moving on to the minimap, I don't tend to mess around with the minimap size or anything. I keep it all as it presently is, mostly just down to the fact that I don't feel there is any need to mess around with the minimap size. I can expand it if I want to, and I can keep it small if I want to. And I don't mess around with any of this except for the opacity of the ADS. This is something I drop right down. I turn this down to around about 20. Gadget icons I also turn around to about 10, and the reason for that is because when you're aiming down sights, you don't want anything else to be in your way except for that of the visual view of the player you're looking at, and that's something I highly recommend changing. Moving on to advance, I turn off Sojo auto-leaning because auto-leaning in the game actually hinders you, however I keep the peak system on. Now, auto-leaning in Battlefield 5 actually makes more of your body exposed than it needs to be if you were to lean yourself manually, and that's just a complete hindrance and completely not worth having on, so I turn that off at all given points. However, it's quite useful to have an auto-peek system because 9 times out of 10, if you're crouched down behind a wall and you hit L1, you do just want to look over the wall. It's not really too difficult. Alongside that, we move on down here. I turn off the hint reload system. We don't want any of that on. Turn off the hint system as well. Network graphs, don't want any of that either. You keep that on, but you shouldn't necessarily need the aim lead indicator if your internet isn't dying. And of course, the aim assist slowdown and auto rotation I keep on purely because they are beneficial. The slowdown does help to some degree at certain ranges, and I could pretend that I'm like some elite pro that never uses aim assist, but the truth of the matter is that when everybody on console automatically is, there is no point hindering yourself and turning it off unless you see it actually ultimately get in your way. Moving on to this is always 3D headphones. Hardware related wise, I highly recommend having a surround sound headset for Battlefield 5. I personally use the Astro headsets myself. The reason for that is because it makes identifying any kind of stuff in the game, like shots, like footsteps, like shells, much easier, and it gives you good positional awareness of what is happening in the game around you. Moving on to video, we've got some stuff you want to mess around with here. I turn my brightness up to around about 65, but of course that will be monitor dependent. The monitor I have is really good at displaying colors, but I have the brightness a little bit higher, purely because Battlefield 5 is quite a dark game. Moving on, field of view I have set to 75, and the reason for that is because field of view is something that is beneficial when it's larger, because you can see more things on any given screen. I feel when it gets too high it looks a little bit unnatural. 75 seems to be a nice sweet spot, And of course, I'm on PlayStation 4 Pro, so that won't necessarily impact my performance, but of course, if you're not on a 4K variant, you may see it impact your performance in some degree. Same thing applies to third-person vehicular stuff. I'd bump that up as well to around about the 70s. And ADS field of view I would turn off because you don't necessarily want to see a less zoomed in version of what you're already aiming at. Motion blur, I keep it around 50%. This is something that a lot of people turn off, but for me, I think it actually smooths out certain parts of the game as opposed to bothering me. Some people I know turn motion blur completely off. I tend to keep it on to a little bit of a degree. 50 to 30% is normally what I aim, and I think it allows the game to look kind of smooth and doesn't have too many jagged edges and doesn't bother me too much. Down here, you want to turn all of these off. Chromatic aberration, you want to turn right off. Film grain, you definitely want to turn off. This weird vignette thing, definitely off. Lens distortion, definitely off. All of that will make your video settings much more clearer and much easier to see. So troops, that's about it for all of the options I use in Battlefield 5. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments section below. I truthfully believe that these are the best settings you can possibly use. If you have any hardware questions that can improve your game, also drop them down below. I'm pretty good with hardware, and I'll be able to point you in the right direction. As always, folks, it's been the Tactical Brit. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again in the next video.